order. At this time, I'll yield the floor to our co-chairs, Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein.
Well, thank you so much. And I just want to kick us off by thanking all of you for taking your time to participate in this work group. I can tell you without a doubt that despite dealing with pandemic and hurricanes, the people of North Carolina really care about this issue and the work of this task force, and are really looking to us to come up with solutions that will make a difference for the future. So I want to underscore the importance of what we're doing and the public interest in what we're doing, and at the same time acknowledge the difficulty that in the past, our country has a history of appointing commissions to study the aftermath of uprising, public disturbances, whatever we want to call the demonstrations. And often real structural change doesn't necessarily follow. So keeping in mind both the importance of what we're doing and the challenge, I'm excited about, I know we have the right people with true commitment, and I have every faith that we will live up to North Carolina's motto, to be rather than to seem, and that this commission truly will make a difference. So I want to be clear, Attorney General Stein and I are here to be a resource to you, but we're not voting members. This is your working group, and we really are looking to you for your leadership. So thank you.
Thank you, Justice Earl. Attorney General.
Thank you, Justice Earls, Mayor Colvin. Very much appreciate being with you all this morning. Appreciate your all's commitment to working on this this issue. As Justice Earl said, this is a challenging issue. This isn't easy stuff, or else a lot of these issues would have been addressed in the past. And so as you go through this stuff, I expect there'll be some issues where there's pretty broad consensus, and if there is, feel free to bring those to the task force whenever you have gotten to that point of agreement, much like we did in our second meeting, where we adopted 3 recommendations as a task force on sort of low-hanging but important fruit. And so if you have that, feel free to do it. Don't feel obligated to do that. A lot of this is, there may be agreement very clearly and early on the objective, but there may be differences on how you get there. And so if it takes a little more time to work through it, don't feel bad. That's why we're having you meet a number of times, because we recognize these are really challenging issues. And so look forward to observing and chiming in if so moved. I will apologize. I have to get off in 10 minutes for just a few minutes, but we'll be back on. So if you see me bounce back and forth, I apologize.
Thank you, Attorney General Stein. So I just would like to thank both Justice Earls and Attorney General Stein for the opportunity. Thank you for a great team that you've assembled, professional law enforcement combined with great legislator and myself, to hopefully bridge the gap and to increase the foundation of trust between our police and our community. And thank you for the support. The team that you've given us to support this work group is absolutely wonderful so far, and I look forward to some great things. And so, just as chair, I always like to make sure that as we start this process, that the team knows that hopefully we will work together to come up with the best ideas to recommend back to the task force. I like to be a good steward of your time. I think we've targeted around 90 minutes as a target, so I'll try to keep us on task and on schedule, but we'll rely upon each other, and I hope that you would speak freely and openly and honestly about your opinions. And so I look forward to accomplishing great things with the help of you guys. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Colvin. That's a perfect segue into us thinking about what the group needs in order to ensure that we can all work together in collaboration, that we can use our time wisely, and that we can rely on each other for not only our expertise, but I really greatly appreciate you establishing the idea of trust, that the work group working together towards building a deeper sense of trust with law enforcement and the public and bringing everyone's ideas together, not only the folks who are on this task force, but ensuring that folks who are out in the community, their voices are heard as well. And so I'd like to, I'm Michael, by the way. Hello, everybody. Good morning. One of the facilitators from NCCJ, along with Karen Dyer. And I'd like to open it up to the rest of the working group members to talk a little bit about what they feel they might need or they would like to see as the process goes on to ensure that our time is used wisely, that we are able to collaborate and that all ideas are honored and respected. And so what I like to have you do is sort of think about, when you've been in these sort of situations before, task force or coming together as a collective like this, what's worked well for you? What have you needed to ensure that you feel like every time you jump on the call, that your time is valued and worthwhile? So I'd like to start off with Chief Davis, if you don't mind. Sorry to put you right on the spot, but if you don't mind sharing, what do you feel you would like to see not only this group accomplish, but also how would you like the process to go? What do you feel like you need to make the process fruitful for you?
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve on this particular group. I am personally interested in having, input, and I think my perspective is a little bit of a different perspective as it relates to the changes that I think that we need to see within the law enforcement industry. That's why I signed up for this particular group. But as far as facilitating conversation and ensuring that we all, reach the goals that we've set forth, I think we should all come in with an open mind. And, I plan to take this as a learning experience as well. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm typing and taking copious notes so that I can ensure that the messages that are shared here at some point are conveyed, not just in my department, but to other bodies and also to the community that I serve here in North Carolina. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chief Davis. Representative Galliard.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to serve. I'm looking forward to being a part of the committee. So I think I echo many of the sentiments of Chief Davis and what she shared. I will say that what's helpful for me is as much advanced reading, advanced data, advanced information, so that our time together is actually used on real discussion and deliberating versus, getting information on the fly and then not having really time to process it. So that's helpful for me. I am very much a structures systems guy. Just a quick background, I pastor a church in Rocky Mount. I'm a native of Philadelphia, undergrad and grad work in Atlanta, and I've been a North Carolinian for 15 years. And so, and this has become even more personal for me because I have a 23-year-old son in the Rocky Mount Police Academy. And so and my very best friend to this day, who's been my best friend for 30 years, just retired as chief of police in Philadelphia. So, this is a very personal kind of issue for me. I'm a structures guy, I'm a systems guy. And so I believe that the structures are not dysfunctional. I think they give you exactly what they're structured to give you. And so I'm really interested in our structural changes, and I hope out of the committee, we'll be able to identify both short-term and long-term solutions to kind of get toward a better result. So really excited to serve, and I'm certainly here to do whatever I can do.
Thank you very much. Mayor Colvin, you've laid some things out already, but I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to share some other thoughts if you'd like.
I think it's, I summed it up in the initial remarks, and certainly they've hit a lot of the key areas. I think we all have the same goals in mind. I just wanted to make sure that we understand that this is an open dialogue, free to speak, and we have to be open and honest. And I think that's the only way we'll receive the type of results as a task force and as a work group that the governor expects for us. We just have to have some real candid conversations. So look forward to it, and we know that we're all on the same team with it. So thank you.
All right. So we'll pass it back over to you, Mayor Colvin, to talk about this meeting's goals and what we hope to accomplish for the next hour or so.
Thank you so much. Can we just mute our phones and then mute our mics, and then I guess whoever's the facilitator will unmute us, so we certainly have the capability to do it. But during the first meeting, Leslie Dismukes and I had talked extensively about how we talk to you. It was very important to hear input from you, the work group, as to what your priorities were, to establish maybe 3 top priorities to use each meeting, kind of specifically to integrate subject matter expert coming in and presenting to us, as well as the group being able to share. So meeting number 1, the meeting goals was basically will be an overview of the process that we'll use to kind of get us through our future meetings. We'll lay out details about how we collect ideas and how we summarize that, and how we schedule that along with the scheduled meetings, which they'll go over that in detail, again, to determine the top 3 priorities for this particular area. Leslie has sent out a substantive agenda, which kind of was very detailed and outlined, and I guess we'll work our way through there to see if there are anything, any items on here that can be consolidated or even replaced, or even like Attorney General Stein said, if we can receive consensus on the low-hanging fruit, that we'll push those items forward back to the overall task force as quickly as possible. So maybe we'll run through that, and then we'll create a schedule that works for everyone. Again, respecting your time and just seeing the number of meetings that we have, and the deadlines and the hard stop dates. I think there's a timeline that was enclosed in your reader heads, and Representative Gallard certainly understand the importance of trying to get information to you ahead of time, being that we'll have some time in between our meetings. We want to try to make sure that we push out as much information to the work group as possible so that we can read over it and spend our 90 minutes effectively. So that's kind of an overview of where we are and what we plan to try to accomplish for today. And with that, I'll go to Ms. Angela Towns.
Good morning, everyone. This morning, I am going to share SharePoint with you. SharePoint is where you are going to find all the material that you might need for any and all things task force. You may want to bookmark this page. That way you will have it for ease of access. On your screen, you'll see that we have living documents. Living documents is where you'll find the master schedule, which is updated regularly. We also have a calendar that lists all of our meeting dates. So if you look to the right of the screen, you can use this to keep track of our meeting dates and see when other groups are meeting, because you will not receive invites for those. But if you want to pop in on someone else's meeting, that would be fine. So another important page that you'll want to use is the working groups page. So I'm going to click on that. So here is our working groups page. So on that page, you'll find the document specific to our working group. You can click on working group 1. Let's see what we have in there so far. You have your resources, you have your agenda, our meeting minutes. That's where you'll be able to find and identify anything that you're looking for pertaining to our particular working group. The resources section is where we'll upload any PDFs or any research that you might want to use for your policy recommendations and that kind of thing. In addition to emailing the agenda and uploading it to your calendar, I will upload agendas in that folder for ease of access. Same thing with the minutes. Once the minutes are done, I'll upload them into the meetings folder and you can refer to them at your leisure. Leslie will speak to the idea bank in a moment. But I just wanted to be able to show you that page, and my job is to act as a resource for you guys to help you navigate this system and work out any issues that you might have with it. You have any questions? Okay.
Thank you, Angela. I appreciate that. So, Leslie, yeah, could you talk to us a little bit about the idea?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. Good morning, everyone. As Mayor Colvin said, I'm Leslie Dismukes, and I'm Criminal Bureau Chief at the Department of Justice. Angela and I actually work together at work as well as in this task force, so it's a great working relationship. Angela is your administrative staff lead, and I'm your substantive staff lead. Angela is a paralegal in our special prosecutions and law enforcement section, so she actually works to support our special prosecutors, but also both commissions, both the Sheriff Standards Commission and the CJ Standards Commission. So Angela is well versed in the commission work and a lot of the ideas, I think, that we're going to be talking about. I wanted to share with you the brief ideas, and Angela mentioned on the idea bank, and I'm going to try to share my screen while I'm doing this. The idea bank is a very lengthy document put together by DOJ staff that has really great resources for our working group. I have taken that and have tried to distill that. Well, there we go. I've tried to distill that based upon our area of responsibility in our working group. And so we were given 3 tasks by the governor's order, and then there was a 4th task that was based on the surveys. And I have tried to distill that into a working document based upon my pre-conversations with the members of this work group and also conversations with Mayor Colvin. Again, this is just an overview, trying to put things in buckets to give us a starting point to consider. The idea bank itself is much more detailed and contains resources and that kind of thing. So just to walk through this, which I will post to our working group website for everyone, our first area of responsibility is surrounding recruiting and retaining a diverse and racially equitable workforce. There were a lot of ideas in the idea bank and a lot of ideas that you have all provided. Ideas provided by our working group members are in blue. I put these into 3 basic buckets. The first are logistical issues, things like increased salaries and shortened shifts. The second is entry requirements, bars to entry to the profession, whether we want to take a look at criminal history and past substance misuse, whether those might be things that might help us broaden our pool of applicants for the profession. And then intentionality was a big one, expanding the CJ Fellows program to allow access to education surrounding what might be needed to go into the profession. And then being intentional about recruitment, where we go to recruit, who we actively recruit, as opposed to just letting people apply and not actively seeking good recruits. And then recruitment strategies that result in officers who reflect the communities that they serve. So those were some of the initial ideas surrounding that first area of responsibility. Again, I see this as a jumping off point for our later discussion that I think Karen's going to mediate, and certainly can change and add any of these ideas as we go along. I'm going to be keeping good notes. The second area of responsibility is law enforcement training to promote public safety and build community trust. And again, I put these into a couple of buckets. These are just my way of mentally trying to organize the subject matter areas. The first I felt was training process. So creating standards for training that are non-optional and don't result in departments just checking the box, particularly in racial equity training. Making it easier to revise in-service topics. This is something that CJ and sheriffs are currently considering. Whether we want to look at the idea of psych evaluations more than just the initial psych eval. The second bucket is specific subject matter training, implicit bias training that's contextual to the communities and not facilitated by those people with those biases that they're training about. I think that's an important point from Representative Galliard. Crisis intervention training, I added into that also SCAT and de-escalation training, then critical thinking and problem solving, emotional intelligence, bias interruption, power dynamics and community interactions, anti-sexual misconduct, trauma, mental health management, stress, SRO training. Again, these are all topics that we can discuss in a more fulsome way later, just to kind of bucket them for our consideration. The third area of responsibility is law enforcement accountability and culture. So the first here are two, I put them under the recommendations made, the first task force stating duty to intervene and prohibition on neck holds. But they both go to accountability and culture. Those are things the task force has already accomplished. The second is, and Chief Davis said this, and I really love it, culture eats policy for lunch. And that's, I think that meaning that if you don't have a good culture, it doesn't matter what your policies are. And I think that that's a good thought process. And so I wanted to capture that she said to me here in this document. Again, these ideas, prioritizing a diverse mix of people throughout the ranks, because they're the ones making the decisions about programming. Police culture, not necessarily a black or a white thing, it's a police thing, needing to change that. Again, that could surround some of the concepts about demilitarization. And there were a lot of concepts about that in the idea bank. And then that the police belong to the taxpayers, so that they should reflect them. Another part of this area of responsibility is transparency about officer misconduct, looking at issues about public records and personnel records to determine what information can be released, and maybe setting some goals around that. What the Standards Commission's roles are around transparency and officer misconduct. Also, continuing accountability and culture. Most of our feedback came in this third bullet point. Systemic changes, so pattern and practice, investigative authority, officer-involved shooting, standardization, revising requirements to receive funding, giving folks different incentives, looking at citizen review boards, access to body cam footage, agencies providing demographic data regarding the makeup of the department, but then also collecting and maintaining data about stop, frisk, search, and seizure, perhaps getting the school of government involved there, policies and procedures for mass demonstrations, revising stop and frisk policies, when you use them, how you employ them on certain populations, no-knock warrant restrictions, record review every 5 years, not just when there is an issue that arises and we need to be reactive. The second bucket here is community interaction, community meetings and tours, meet and greets with faith-based community organizations during the BLET process to get them familiar with their communities, positive non-enforcement activities in the neighborhoods with frequent police contact, requiring officers to give certain information to public during the interactions, embracing a guardian mindset and transparency. Again, some of these things are things that the commissions could do, and we could make recommendations to the commissions in these areas. And then finally, the fourth area is not one that was under the governor's order, but was one that was a result of the surveys, and that's enhancement of the law enforcement profession. That's almost, in my view, it overarches our three priorities, and certainly can mix and mingle with those other priorities. But certainly looking at the data on the effectiveness of community policing, I thought was part of that enhancement. I do have one more slide, but I'll save that until our next steps at the end, and that's about the timeline. If I can stop my sharing. So I'll post that to our working group site, and I will also email that to everyone afterwards. Again, just a jumping off point for ideas, and hopefully to spur some of our good conversation here today, so we can figure out what we want to do next, where we want to start with some of these things. And just please know that if there is additional research that needs to be done, or you need additional resources, as certainly as Representative Galliard said, we can get this advanced work to you. Angela and I can work together to do that, so that you'll be able to thoroughly consider the issues and come to the meetings with the ideas fully formed for us to discuss, so that we don't have to talk about them on the fly in the meetings. And we're happy to do that. So I think you all have my contact information. Please feel free to call or email anytime. I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. And at this point, I think I will turn it over to Karen, I believe is next.
Leslie, thank you. That was extremely rich, and really appreciated the way that was organized, and especially having a chance to capture what task force members actually said, and what was important. So, to the task force members, looking at that, it's always interesting. You look at that and said, now, did I say that? I guess I did say that. Anyway, but just for a moment now, for the both of you, a reaction to what you just saw. is there anything else that you might want to add, or is there a place that you really want to start? You want to say, by all means, let's, we can't start everywhere, but let's kind of talk a little bit about where's the somewhere. So again, anything else, just your reaction to what you just saw.
Well, it seems really comprehensive, and so I think it gives us a good some good perspective to. I mean, it's broad. The question that surfaced for me is if we could, was there anything that Leslie submitted or shared that we could have consensus on that might be low hanging fruit already? And so I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but I would love to have some collective IQ around. And the question for me, and it may not be low hanging fruit at all, but I'm wondering if the issue of citizen review boards could be something that we could have a serious conversation about and maybe make a recommendation about. That was one of the things that jumped out for me.
Okay. Chief Davis.
Well, I thought that was a very good comprehensive overview, Leslie, of our conversation. You did really good about quoting me, that's for sure. And, but I'm really passionate about, I think, some of the cultural issues that exist in police departments that community members know nothing about, and sometimes wonder after those cultural, issues or problems manifest themselves into, tragic public kinds of problems. And if you think in terms of the various, tragedies that have occurred, it wasn't just that an officer had a bad day. There were some very long-term systemic kinds of problems within police departments that oftentimes get ignored because people just don't know that there needs to be a deeper dive into how departments operate and, what's effective. And I know even from a civilian review board, the civilian review board process is another process that's sort of after the fact. Something has happened and, the public wants to have input on how we, address that issue. My focus is how do I prevent those issues from occurring? How do I, ensure that I have a healthy, well-run police department? And we can't be a perfect department. I know that that's not going to happen, but to minimize those types of incidents. So some of what I saw in that presentation really hit how we could effectively impact, training and recruitment and monitoring and, having a closer look on a day-to-day basis as it relates to how our officers treat the community, how they engage with the community, and how we work to meet the community where they are, as opposed to just always responding, to calls for service. So I know I said a lot, but I know that this is a great opportunity to look at some of those really key elements that Leslie brought out after, interviewing everybody. I didn't want to take all of her time, but just to talk about what training looks like for officers, and not just training at the very beginning of an officer's career. What does ongoing training look like after they get that BLET certification? We just think that we send them out, to the world, and they do in-service training, but a lot of the in-service training that's done is kind of a check the box too. A lot of it is electronic. A lot of it is, I could have my sixth grader to do my training at home for me. And quite frankly, the way it's set up, it could very well happen that way. So I question sometimes also the processes in which we train our officers to ensure that they are really getting it, as opposed to a sort of glossing over and checking the box on certain kinds of issues.
Chief, I wanted to jump in there. I think you hit a critical point. Representative Gallagher, I think that the low hanging fruit to me, I think would start under the type of officers that we're bringing in, because I think that just like any organization, the greatest asset are the people who work there. And so under the first one where it says recruiting and retaining the diverse work group, I don't think there's any question that salaries should be increased. You know, that's more of a budgetary discussion. But the shifts shortened to make sure that the people who we're sending out on the street are at their best, that their mental well-being is intact. And that will, you know, we know how it is when people for any service industry are having a bad day. We can tell when we go, whether it's to a restaurant or wherever. There are a number of factors that cause their behavior to reflect that. Only thing about this is in law enforcement, if they're having a bad day, it could be a life or death situation for somebody, whether it's the officer or whether it's the person that they're confronting. If they're having a bad day personally, the actions have real serious consequences. So I think our low hanging fruit, I think if we zero in on I think there's probably very little discussion that we need to make sure that we have a diverse law enforcement agency across the community, because most of the interactions and the problems are specifically happening into African American and communities of color. So how do we get more of them on the side of law enforcement, that they can be that natural bridge and connection between those communities that have the most interactions and the most confrontations? So I think if we can start in area number one, if there's some things we can immediately check off of this box and send to the task force, that seems like a great place to start, in my opinion.
Chief Davis, Representative Galliard, any other response, reaction to what you've heard from any of your colleagues?
No, I mean, I think I often say the key to retention is recruitment. And, you know, you hire right, it really has a ripple effect throughout the organization. I think, Mayor, though, I don't know how low that's hanging. Only because I feel like and I agree, I do think it's probably the appropriate starting place, but as I reflect upon the recruitment process, as I understand it, as a state representative, as a pastor, as a more of a user of the system, if you will, versus being in the system, it seems as if, to me, the current process is designed to not give opportunity to people that might actually be amazing officers simply because they have a past. And I think that piece has to get fixed, and I don't know all the nuances of it. But, you know, I'm nervous, you know, if I'm hiring somebody on my staff and I get their resume and, you know, they don't have no sin in it and no issues in it, I'm struggling about how effective they're going to be dealing with people that I know they have to deal with. And it seems as if our current process, as I understand it, is very sterile. And as long as I'm checking this box and I appear to be this person and I say all the right things that I know people are going to expect me to say, I'm good. You know, but this guy that, you know, might have had a marijuana charge, you know, when he was 19, and, you know, he's good and his life has changed, you know, he doesn't even get a shot. And so I do think the recruitment piece is great, but I just think we're going to have to really drill and dig. I don't think it's hanging as low as we might think.
All right, well, that's good. So how do we, from a professional, okay, so let's go, we'll come back to that, because I think you're right, that's going to require a little more detail. So as it relates to expanding where we look for officers, and I may need some help from some of the professional law enforcement, how heavy are we recruiting in HBCUs? And, you know, here we talked about, we have a program in a traditional Black high school that I went to, E. Smith, but it's a fire program. It tries to enhance participation for minorities in the fire department, but not the police department. I think that, what's the recruitment process like to historically Black colleges and high schools and to communities of color?
Well, I can speak to that. You know, I can speak on behalf of my department. We absolutely seek out opportunities at historically Black colleges, and not just go to their job fairs, but actually set up job fairs, you know, at the colleges throughout the year, and ensure that our our promotional material is available to them. But, you know, when I talk about, you know, how we recruit as a department, you know, I can speak for me as African-American female chief that knows how important it is to go out and hire minorities. I don't know that that is the philosophy for every chief in the state of North Carolina or the 18,000 agencies around the country, how important diversity is and gender diversity is within a police department. So, you know, I can check, you know, several different types of, you know, recruitment initiatives that I have in place that's intentional to hire a diverse work group, including bilingual officers as well. You know, we're reaching out to the bilingual, to our Latinx community as well. But is that happening around the country? Or is that happening around the state of North Carolina? I don't think so. You know, and it's reflective in the ranks of some of the agencies, you know, around the state. So I'm not saying that, you know, people are being denied because applications continuously come in at various, you know, in various departments. But how intentional is it to go out to those areas where there are larger pools of, you know, applicants who meet those requirements? And sometimes it could be economics, it could be money, it could be that, you know, departments don't have the recruitment funds to go to different places, you know, as needed. But even electronically these days, you can have promotional types of recruitment campaigns that are electronic that reach different colleges and whatnot. So I think it's very important, and I think it's important that those individuals that are recruiting look like the police department that they represent. So, and I give the example to my recruiters. When I first came to Durham, I had an all-white recruitment unit. And they told me that we have a hard time hiring minorities. Well, guess what? If I was a college student at a HBCU and I went to a job fair, I'm going to look for that agency that has somebody that looks like me. That not just at, you know, the entry level, but all the way through, you know, the ranks of the department, because quite frankly, officers come on the departments and they want to know that they have opportunities to rise through the ranks. And if they don't see, you know, individuals that look like them in higher ranks, they might say, you know what, I didn't sign on just to be a police officer. I want to be able to be that sergeant or be that commander or even be that chief. So I think recruiting is a really, really important part of the process of ensuring that we have diverse departments. And not only that, once you get them through the door, how do you ensure that they make it through the process? And sometimes that system is set up where minority applicants have a difficult time making it through the process, even as they go into the classroom setting. And I'm not saying that we have to give answers to people to pass tests, but we should set up our recruiting and our training so that we help people be successful in being police officers, as opposed to saying, okay, I got 4 that I ran off. And that sometimes that is the conversation. I'm just being candid. You know, we ran off 4 this week because traditionally that was the thing. You had to show yourself approved in order to be part of, you know, the law enforcement industry. Went through it. There were 11 women in my class when I came on. It was 35 of us. Only 2 women graduated out of that class. Do I think they would not have made good officers? Absolutely not. There were several different mechanisms put in place that literally ran women off at that time. And sometimes I think that those types of mechanisms are still in place in some departments to kind of set up so that people are not succeeding as we have this honest conversation.
So that's great. So Representative Gallo and you, Chief, from a policy perspective, what can we do, recommend to the task force from a policy perspective? We probably can't fix the budgetary stuff. I don't think the legislator or the governor's going to write us a big check to start initiatives, but from a policy perspective, is there a standard or is there any state barriers that say that if you have a certain background or criminal charge that you disqualify, or is that to the discretion of the hiring police department?
Well, I think Leslie can probably help chime in. It's a combination of both. You know, departments have standards, and of course, the state has standards as well. And some of those requirements and standards have a tendency to eliminate, you know, applicants who may have had, say, for instance, prior drug usages. And over the years, law enforcement agencies, including federal entities, have relaxed some of those standards because certain types of drugs were just, you know, kind of part of that experimental process for young people. You know, back in the day, it was hard to find an applicant who had not experimented with marijuana. You know, not that they had abused marijuana or sold marijuana, but to have experimented with it, and how many usages and how often, and those kind of things come into play. Leslie, you might want to chime in on that. You probably know a little bit more about it being on the commission than I do.
Sure, Chief, thanks. You know, I do think that there are probably areas where we can look at what is required in the administrative code right now, and where there might be areas for revisions. The subcommittee that the chief and I serve on in CJ is the Planning and Standards Committee, and a lot of the rules revisions to the administrative code come to us in our committee. And so one area that this group might consider is what rules revisions might we make suggestions to the commission for adoption, and that certainly would then become part of the administrative code. We can look at some of that as part of some of the pre-work for perhaps one of the next meetings. I can look through the code and see what areas that there might be that would give us some things to consider, and perhaps send those to you in advance of one of the next meetings, depending on how we decide to organize our process. So I can definitely do that for the group.
And that's what I'd like to ask, is so getting that additional information from Leslie, is there other information or a speaker or anyone that can help to inform this as a possible recommendation? Is there anyone that you'd like to hear from, or just really consider the information that Leslie's able to provide? Is that sufficient?
Well, one thought I had in response to what Chief Davis said is that a lot of these things are, what is the, how much does a local law enforcement agency really want to tackle this issue? Who are they sending out to recruit? Where are they going to recruit? Like the mayor said, are they going to HBCUs? I think we could come up with some sort of best practices on recruiting a diverse workforce, where we get ideas from Durham, where we get ideas from other agencies that are really intentional about this, and have that be available to every agency out there. Doesn't mean you're going to get universal uptake on it, but I bet you there are a lot of well-intentioned agencies that just hadn't figured it out, and they may not have the HR department of something like a big city like Durham does. But if we gave them sort of a template on, here's a good way you can diversify your workforce, they might take it up.
Well, if I can just follow up on that, I wondered as the discussion was going on, whether there's any data on what is the racial and ethnic makeup of police forces across the state. So I am thinking that the EEOC, that there's a requirement of reporting to the EEOC, so that there might be a centralized source of that information. But just to get a snapshot of how diverse are our police forces across the state would seem to be useful, and it would help us identify places that appear to be reflecting the local population. And of course, you know, that brings up questions about what is the appropriate comparison out west. You know, are we comparing to just the county or broader, like what is the recruitment area? So I recognize there's always some conceptual challenges, but at any rate, can we measure as an initial matter? But then the second thought that came up was whether who has already done this, right? So has Noble, for example, do they have best practices for recruiting a diverse workforce, or does the International Association of Chiefs of Police? I mean, there's some national groups that I'm sure have done some work around this that could help jumpstart this as well.
Justice Earls, you're correct. It's absolutely out there already. And it's available to chiefs around the country. There's a program that IACP started some time ago where they have a library of research and documents that's accessible to all of their members on best practices. Noble also has done work and participated also in the hiring and retention types of issues. So I would be glad to be a resource to provide some of that information, because you're absolutely right. It's one of those areas that, you know, unless somebody brings it up as an issue, it's not an issue. And hiring and retention has never been an issue at the state level, so to speak, of how police departments, you know, hire and retain. It was some years ago because there was obvious, you know, a lack of diversity in police departments when I came on, and there were, you know, the federal government was providing grants and, you know, really encouraging the police departments to become more diverse. And during that period, they did. And then, of course, after a few years, there was not as much of a focus, and departments were kind of left on their own to fill their ranks however, you know, they were able to. But I think there are opportunities to glean from work that has already been done from IACP, from Noble, from major city chiefs as well.
I want to chime in. I believe Representative Gallagher has been trying to have a word, if you would like to share some thoughts.
I appreciate it. I think I wanted to comment on the Attorney General's statement about a template, and I think it's a great idea, but as we look at the template, I do think it needs to be, for lack of a better term, I'll say tiered. What the police department in Durham can do and what the police department in Rocky Mount can do are drastically different. And what happens is when smaller municipalities get documents like that, if they're too robust, they just get dismissed. But if they're scaled to, say, departments of 250 officers to 300, or whatever the tiering is, can do these things, and departments that have 1,000+ officers can do these things, or whatever, just to kind of template it, because if we don't present it that way, it won't filter down. The larger municipalities will take advantage of it, but the smaller ones will just kind of throw it in the trash, and it won't get executed. And then the other comment I wanted to make was around us looking at whether or not there can be tweaks in our administrative code in terms of standards. And as Leslie brings that back, I'm just curious, and maybe Chief Davis could comment on it. I'm just wondering, is there an appetite for that? I mean, what would be the response of police chiefs around the state? Do you have any sense, Chief Davis, of whether or not there's even an appetite for looking at the possibility of relaxing some standards?
You know, it goes both ways. You have, sometimes you have folks at the table, you know, in leadership positions that embrace the change and have recognized that we need to do something different. And then you have leaders that will hang on to dear life to keep everything the same, that feel like, you know, it hasn't been a problem over the years. Why should we do this now? I think it really requires a conversation at a higher level, that the philosophy that has been embraced by law enforcement over the years is a philosophy that needs to change, and that we all need to be a part of the conversation in trying to impact that change. So you will have individuals that, you know, just from my experience, you know, working with the commission, you have some folks, and Leslie can attest to it, that, you know, quite frankly, wouldn't want to see any changes. And then I think if it's presented in a way where it's for the betterment of the industry as a whole and for the communities that we serve, if it's if it's articulated in the appropriate way, I think we would have the appropriate buy-in.
I think right now is, I mean, we've got, this has been extremely robust, and it sounds like, you know, what began as, you know, can we have a little low-hanging fruit? And I think that, Mayor Colvin, you know, Mayor Colvin saying, well, yeah, this could be low-hanging fruit, and look at where this has actually grown.
Right.
So we've got a process here. I think that there definitely, this could be a recommendation. It sounds like there's definitely some passion and interest about this. Leslie's going to bring a little bit more information, and I think that even for their next meeting, you know, we can kind of move, because we definitely have some ideas about how this could go. But I'm gonna push you just a little further, because we could continue on this particular topic a little bit more. There's a lot to talk about, but I also think that there's some other things based on the information that you had shared. Michael, I'm going to ask you to, if you might, you know, kind of see if we could come up with a couple of other recommendations or ideas that are really probably priorities that would be helpful as we move forward. But thank you.
Absolutely. And I wanted to say, based on what I was hearing in that conversation, it seemed like there are a couple of ways for us to consider. You know, it sounded like we need to have an assessment, like a true, honest assessment of, you know, where the current culture is. Where are we currently? Who's doing what we want to do well? And what do we do with the information that we gather to forward recommendations to the group? You know, it seems to be a need for some expertise, as far as some insight, as far as like, where are people on this subject, and that's coming through well in this conversation. And some of that work, in the second task force meeting, the presentation talked about sort of we have two things that we're working on simultaneously, right? We have the people aspect, right? The entry point. So who are the people who are actually encountering folks on the streets, right? Who are actually the practitioners here. And we have the systemic issues, right? And so we're kind of holding both at the same time. Which lever needs to be pulled first to make some immediate changes, right? And which levers do we need to have some more assessment around? You know, I said this to another group is, you know, if we think about this as healing, right? There's some things that we can do right now. There's some pills we can give, you know, some medication you can take until you can go see a doctor, right? And then we're going to have to do a longer term plan of assessment to think about how do we make these changes, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that not only are we being asked, or are you all being asked to consider what needs to be recommended, but also how do we monitor these things? How do we make sure these things get implemented, right? And so I really, really appreciate Representative Galliard bringing into consideration the scalability of these things. Like, how do we actually roll out what we want to see happen? And so as you think about this conversation that we just had, you know, things that bubbled up for me, there's four, you know, we have the four recommendations, but it sounded like we were revolving around recruitment and culture, right? What's the current culture? Who are we bringing in? What kind of barriers are there? And so as you think about the conversation we just had and around, you know, recruitment and culture, where, again, I guess we'll go back to that. What would be the thing that if as we go into the next meeting, right? As we go into our next session, what might we need to be taking top priority so that time can be used well, so that when we move into what kind of report we're going to give back to the task force, what kind of recommendations are going to come out of this working group, for first off, to gain larger consensus, what those things might be, what we might need to be able to ensure that we can do that next time.
In terms, I've got a couple of ideas in organizational that it sounds like the recruitment is our area of responsibility, number one. So it sounds like there were two main things that we were discussing there. One is barriers to entry, and the other is how we go out and proactively recruit the populations that we want in our police departments and sheriff's offices. And so the barriers to entry piece, at least for next time, what I can make sure to do is research the code and bring back to the task force ahead of time to the committee members, ideas for what areas of the code we might want to look at. And then it also sounded like Chief Davis has the in with Noble and IACP in order to get some of that information, but perhaps we might consider for our first speaker for someone surrounding recruiting and who can talk to us about what best practices in that area might be. So that would be perhaps a suggestion for how to get us started on that issue so that we can come out with some recommendations from there.
I think that's a great idea.
Right, and also what Justice Earls had said about making sure, getting some information, we can get a snapshot about the racial and ethnic makeup. That would be some information as well. That would help.
And to that point, Karen, I failed to mention earlier that we do have a data team that's helping us also. And so when we come up with these ideas that we need data, we have those resources. So I did write down Justice Earls' question for the data team. So I'll make sure to reach out and help get that moving as well.
If I could just jump in real quick, not to muddy this water at all, but I'm wondering, is there a way to get data on graduation rates out of BLET statewide based on gender and race? Because to Chief Davis's comment, and there's been comment around culture as well, I think this is almost an issue that it's not an either or, but kind of a both and. And if we're successful at recruiting the right people we're trying to recruit, but they're entering into a culture that doesn't enable them to succeed, we haven't really moved the needle like we wanted to move the needle. And so part of me feels like this is almost like a conversation we have to have in synergy and in concert versus in silos. And so I was just wondering if that data was out there, that would be helpful. And then I have a clarifying question for the chief. As we talk about the conversation of culture, is the culture conversation a real conversation amongst police departments, or is it just kind of there and not really discussed? Is it intentional culture creation, or is it just very unintentional?
I think it's a combination of both, if I can say that. And I don't mean to answer it in a way where it's not concise, but I've always believed that, and I've heard it said, the speed of the leader is the speed of the troop. And if the leader is not concerned about the culture, then the culture isn't an issue for the folks in the police department. And, I can look at police departments from the outside looking in, and when I see certain things that happen, I say to myself, they've got a culture issue, because certain types of behaviors have become accepted, or a philosophy that is more altruistic to the work that we do has not been conveyed, to the entire police department as this is the philosophy of this police department. So folks at the top have to recognize first that this isn't just business as usual, and this isn't the traditional, policing that we can continue to keep up, that there are problems that have to be rooted out and dealt with at all levels of the department. And culture change, it takes a lot of time, but first it has to be recognized that there is a problem.
Might I suggest that based on what you said, it sounds like to me that there's some work that can be done in leadership as far as thinking around some of these questions of what is the culture, how does the culture get disseminated through to the troops, if you will. And because if somebody, if I'm coming in as a new recruit, I have a particular paradigm, I have a particular worldview, and that worldview is getting massaged and indoctrinated to some degree. Like when I get into the force, it may shift. And so how if the leader, if the culture that's there, as you said, Galliard, is something that I have to be sort of oriented into, then how does that, perhaps the conversation happens in a different space first before it goes into the recruit train. I'm just throwing that out there as maybe a way to think about how to think about where we might pull that first lever as far as recommendations are concerned. Maybe it's not that we think about the force, but we think about who in the force needs to be getting this sort of training first, so that we can disseminate that down. That's just a suggestion to. I would like to put back into the group to see how that lands, how that feels.
Well, a few years ago, we had an issue with our fire department being less than 5% minority. And so we looked at the process, we looked at the testing, part of it was physical, some was written tests, but we saw that the problem was there were gaps in between the process, maybe 8, 10, 12-week gaps before a person was able to start making any money. And that overwhelmingly disqualified minorities because they don't have 3 or 4 months to sit while the process is happening. So it could be some things like that. What we did on our city manager side, we wanted to make a goal of diversity in our economic spending. So we made that a part of his evaluation. So maybe what she's saying is as these municipalities look to see how we can implement some of this stuff, we make it a part of the evaluation for the city manager and the police chief to come up with and make sure that their compensation is tied to the success of it. I mean, that was some of the triggers that we pulled locally to change the culture, because people take it a lot more serious when their personal finances are in the middle of it.
Absolutely.
I can answer, Representative Galliard, the question that you asked about the data on the demographics of the graduates from BLET. One thing that we are getting ready to consider next week at our CJ meeting is how to better capture the data all the way through. Right now, it's my understanding that there is data about who graduates, but we don't have an idea of who starts the process so that we can compare the two. And so we're considering a rule change for next week to the administrative code to make sure that we can gather that data. So I think to your question, I'm not sure that it exists right this moment, but next week we are having a rulemaking hearing on whether or not we can in fact start to gather that data. But I think that our standards divisions at DOJ can probably tell us at least the demographics of the graduates, I think, and I will check into that, but I'm not sure that we know how that compares to who starts and who ends the process. That's something that we will be able to gather after CJ passes the rule, hopefully next week. So I will look into what data we do have at the moment on that issue, at least as far as the graduates are concerned.
I think that would be helpful information. Graduation without matriculation doesn't give you a full picture. So,
and I think you'll probably be surprised at what that data, because that's a data set that has not been generated, across, most states like that. Police departments keep up with it. If I start a class of 35 and I have 13 minorities in that class, and then I graduate that class and only 2 minorities graduated out of that class, I'm starting to ask questions why. So I pay close attention now from the beginning of their process all the way through the end. And every time I lose an applicant, there is a process of explaining to the chief what happened with this applicant. Sometimes it's where the applicant really was not cut out for law enforcement. But then there have been times where I question, so what occurred with this particular individual that caused them to want to resign? And sometimes it's a resignation that people don't question because they feel like, okay, this person just decided they were going to go and do something else. Sometimes there's a different story behind that resignation. And unless police departments are having those exit briefings where they can have unintimidating kinds of conversations with applicants about what occurred in your training that made you want to resign, sometimes you may not ever find out the reason why. But I think gathering those numbers will be interesting to see, you know, how many folks we said we hired. And when I do a report, I can say I hired X amount of minorities and it looks good for me. But how many did I graduate and put out on the street? That's where the real success is.
Chief Davis, I have a question for you. I've seen a lot of discussion about racial diversity and law enforcement not really making a difference because the culture that the law enforcement officers are going into is really what makes the difference. And I'm just wondering how these two things fit together for you, because I know you've talked a lot about culture, but you've also talked about a lot about the importance of diversity and recruitment. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, on how those things work together.
Well, I think it's important that, you know, communities of color see officers that understand the culture in their communities. I also think it's important that, you know, officers from other backgrounds, from Rochester and places that, you know, may have never worked in African-American or minority neighborhoods, they get the type of training and the understanding about the very specific, you know, idiosyncrasies that exist in different communities. That's why I was talking about that ongoing training is really important, so that, you know, officers who've never worked around minorities before can be acculturated in a way where they understand some of those very, you know, specific issues that plague, you know, immigrant communities, that plague, you know, impoverished communities, that plague LGBTQ communities. So, you know, I really believe in ongoing education. So the culture piece, I think, is really important, that throughout the officer's career, he's constantly immersed in different types of environments where they're forced to sort of navigate through sometimes even uncomfortable situations or uncomfortable conversations in order to be successful in their work.
I definitely don't want to derail, but I didn't want us to forget about a couple of things that Representative Galliard and Chief Davis mentioned at the very beginning as well. We were talking about the low-hanging fruit. So you did bring up, so I mean, I think we've got a robust recommendation, and it looks like we'll be discussing that even more, but I don't want to forget about the whole idea of the Citizens Review Board. We've talked about the cultural issues. We've talked about training and recruitment. But I did want to make sure that that one didn't get lost again, since it was one of the ones that was brought up right after we discussed it. So any interest, or are we going where we need to go?
I did want to ask a question on this one. I think, of course, I mean, this is something that we've talked about on a local level. We passed a resolution asking the legislators to grant real authority to it. What do you think the chance for success coming out of this work group, even being referred to the task force, of the legislator expanding those things that make that process real? You know, right now with personnel records and sunshine laws and not being able to release body cam, not being able to do certain things under the personnel protections, what is the goal out of this committee other than to recommend it? I think we all agree that we need some review process, but Representative, what do you think from a legislative standpoint?
I don't think we have a legislative hurdle here. I don't think we have a legislative hurdle. As I study review boards nationally and I start seeing where some of the roadblocks are, one big roadblock is usually with states that are not right to work and have collective bargaining agreements. That always winds up an issue. We don't have that problem here. Nothing's jumping out for me. And so I need to process it for just a moment to think if there's anything that might be there in terms of a legislative hurdle, but I don't think there is. At least nothing's coming out.
And would it be helpful for that to be one of the areas where we have a presenter, someone to come in and talk to us about civilian review boards and who has some expertise in it? Would that be helpful to the group?
It would be to me, because there's been a lot of, I don't want to say misinformation, but basically what we were told was that there would have to be a change or special exception in state law. Like, we looked at some of the local bills that went to Charlotte and Greensboro to basically say, even if you had a review board, there were a number of things that they were not able to do in the process that made them effective. They were not able to review personnel files or to look at body camera footage without a court order, or those are the kind of legislative hurdles that I heard exist. And that's why I was asking you guys, from a professional standpoint that knows the statute about that, tell us what the barriers are that you see a review board being able to do.
I think as well, just discussing the different models of review boards out there and the different degrees of authority and autonomy they have, because I know there are a number of different models.
I'll reach out to legislative analysis and just today when we hang up, and just ask them to give me a summary of what we might be dealing with in terms of statute, and I'll come back to the group with some information.
And the other thing I think might be a hurdle too, as it relates to civilian review boards, is that because body worn camera footage isn't readily accessible, sometimes it's hard to make decisions about different types of incidents if you don't have all of the information that's needed to make an informed decision. So, and sometimes the investigation that has been conducted and delivered to a review board in and of itself is not enough to help make, a well-informed decision. So I think the process, and they vary around the country, what those processes look like. We have our citizens review board members to actually go through the Citizens Police Academy so that they can, and it's part of one of the requirements, so that they can really understand some of the inner workings of the police department, everything from communication systems to, disciplinary processes to, hiring, the whole 9 yards that's presented during that. And I think they find it very informative, because then they can ask, key questions as they're reviewing, various packages. But they still don't receive near as much information that I think a review board should have in order to make very critical decisions about what has potentially occurred in a particular situation. So just something to think about.
I think Chief Davis raises a really good point there. Two things. One is, should we put on a universal requirement for body cams? Because right now, not every officer on the street has one. And I think that's something that a number of states have done. And then I think the second thing is to review the law surrounding who gets to see that footage and when. Right now, it's pretty restrictive. You have to get a court order in order for folks to look at it. But I think that Chief Davis comes up with just a very good example of an entity that should be able to see it without a court order, and that would be the entity that's responsible for accountability if it's a review board. So I think we could look at, are there tweaks that need to be made to the accessibility of this video footage, and should we require everyone to have a body cam so there is more footage out there?
I'd like to lift up what Leslie captured in the presentation earlier, that Chief Davis mentioned that that the police belong to the citizens, right? And so, and one thing that Chief Davis mentioned earlier too is that review boards are often reactive. And so, in thinking about the moves that we need to make, how do we? I think it'd be important. I would like to ask the group to think about too, how do we help the citizenry be more of a proactive voice in what happens as far as the things that we're bringing up are concerned. I appreciate you, Attorney General Stein, bringing up the idea of transparency and how we might be able to address some of that in a very short manner.
I would just, along those lines, I would just, it was my observation that during the first public hearing we had, this was a topic that folks brought up. So it is something that members of the community have asked us to consider as well. And it also seems to me that while it is true that a review board is reviewing something that's already happened, I think there are a number of other elements of what we're trying to achieve that it's intended to address. So I think there is a sense that they are also supposed to be preventative, you know, that they help deter what otherwise might be excessive use of force or other violations of someone's rights, that they should increase the confidence of the public in the police force and policing function, because there's a sense that there's an independent body that's reviewing. So I'm glad to hear this discussion around this, and I just wanted to emphasize that it's something that the public has asked us to look at.
I did have a question. Another thing that we hear about, do you think it would be helpful if there was a state board that had a review authorization of incidents that happen? I know your office, Attorney General, gets a lot of that because the local district attorneys don't want to be in a situation where they're faced to have to make a decision about charging a local police officer or getting at odds with the department. Then I heard kind of jokingly from some law enforcement officers here when we were looking at what the internal affairs process looks like. Well, the SBI reviews it, but a lot of them are ex-members of our department anyway, so we're good. So the citizen participation part, how do you take this process from a state level and could you have this function not only at a local level, but some type of state appointed citizen board that doesn't have the local politics, that basically have, would follow more so under the citizen representation on a state level?
It's a concept I hadn't thought of, Mayor, where you would have a statewide citizen review board. There are states that have not the citizen piece of it, but the prosecutorial piece, that if there has been a police involved shooting, that they will then refer that case either to a neighboring district attorney or to the state attorney general for review, to take it out of that local community, because sometimes it can create awkwardness when the district attorney routinely works hand in hand with police in order to bring cases. And so having some independent review is a model that some states have pursued. And that's on the prosecution side. On the investigation side, I mean, it's typically done by internal affairs, but then similarly, there are places where if there's a police involved shooting, they will either have the State Bureau of Investigation or a neighboring jurisdiction investigator come in and review. Again, just to create a little bit of distance between who's doing the investigation and who did the act.
Representative Galliard, you kind of started this off as we are beginning to get close. What else are you thinking about?
Well, two things, and one is a question for the Attorney General, but I'm wondering, Leslie, you mentioned that we could perhaps get a speaker to address the issue of the police review boards or citizen review boards. I would ask that, could we make the ask of that speaker? And here I go muddying again. I do think sometimes, I think expectation management is important. And sometimes to the Associate Justice's comment, the community asks for something with an expectation, and then they don't get from it what they expected. And so my point to that is, part of the conversation for me would be helpful if we understood, for jurisdictions that have these citizen review boards, are they getting out of them what they expected? I mean, are they really accomplishing something, or is the public kind of emotionally desiring something that's not going to really get the end result that they thought? So for me, it would be helpful to know that answer. And I know that may sound a little contradictory because I'm the one that surfaced the conversation, but I do want to make sure we've done our full due diligence on the question. I think the chief wants to say something, so I'm gonna.
That's a very good point, because that's sort of been the narrative as it relates to civilian review boards. And, you know, is there expectation to see more officers who get discipline that's different, a different recommendation than what the department has recommended? So I can only speak for my department. I can't name one instance between myself and the Civilian Review Board that was a different recommendation or an opinion of what should have happened. There have been times where the Civilian Review Board asked additional questions about an investigation, but the overall recommendation was consistent with what they thought should have happened. Now, that's not to say around the country and other agencies that would be, you know, the same scenario. I think to have a civilian review board, it does give community members and the public a sense of someone else's eyes are on this, you know, investigation, or the department's policies and procedures and so on. And they report out, you know, on a regular basis as it relates to their findings. It sort of keeps everybody above board. But it's like body worn cameras. People thought that body worn cameras were going to be, you know, kind of a smoking gun, that they were going to reveal, you know, more than what they have done. The body worn camera is just, you know, another investigative tool, another piece of the evidence. And I totally support body worn cameras, but I think there's sometimes expectations that there's going to be this different result. And I don't think people should get their hopes up high about that, unless you have departments that are just operating in a rogue way and the Civilian Review Board is just discovering and unearthing all kinds of other issues. But as it relates to transparency, I think that civilian review boards are a very positive element of the work that we do, because they can put a neutral eye or a different perspective on what occurred, you know, in a particular situation as it relates to police officers' engagement with the community.
Chief, I would argue that just because there's not been a difference in the conclusion by your internal affairs and the Civilian Review Board, that's not a metric that means that it's a failure, because there may be some agencies that actually do a better job disciplining, knowing that someone's looking over their shoulder. Just the same concept that a body-worn camera might serve to deter an officer or a member of the public from behaving in a way that they know will be captured on film. And so I think that transparency creates a little more accountability, and it just gives the public, I think the public knowing that, okay, there's not been any difference between the police and the Civilian Review Board. What that tells me is that now I have a little more faith in the way the police handles problems, and it just gives some third-party validation and public confidence.
Absolutely. I agree. I totally agree.
All right.
Just chasing the issue of accountability real quick. Would this be lower hanging? All police involved shootings automatically are investigated by the SBI with oversight from the Attorney General's office?
I no longer supervise the SBI. That got taken a few years ago and given to the Department of Public Safety. So I think in terms of having that investigation, that may be a good idea.
Definitely.
I agree. Yeah.
We should, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Chief. I'd like to hear your view on it. We should reach out to Secretary Hooks and get his take on that too. I'm sorry, Chief Davis, I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, no, I was just saying that I agree. That is our process as a department, that when we have officer involved shootings, we immediately bring the SBI in to conduct the investigation and allow them to provide the results and work with the DA's office to determine whether or not there are any criminal charges that will be filed. And I think that's a best practice. I think if agencies want to demonstrate a level of transparency to the community, especially in serious types of encounters like that, I think it's absolutely a good recommendation. There may be pushback from various police entities. I don't know, but I've been very satisfied with the SBI's process as it relates to officer involved shootings. We haven't had that many, but the ones that we have had, it has been a fluid process for us.
All right, I'm gonna pull this together because we're at that time. And so I'm gonna turn this back over to Mayor Colvin. Rich conversation and fodder for the next meetings. Mayor Colvin.
All right, thank you. And thank you, guys. This has been outstanding discussion. I think we're on the right path. I don't know how low the fruit is hanging, but I think it'll be good fruit once we pick it. So between now and the next meeting on the 20th, any ideas, I guess, that you would like to, what you would like to cover between now and then? And I guess I'll go to Leslie about how, I think kind of a recap about what our goals are to prepare for the next meeting.
Thank you, Mayor Colvin. I'm going to share my screen with you guys again that has a timeline. I think I'm sharing it. There we go. So this is the PowerPoint talking about our areas of responsibility, but looking at this is where we generally are falling. I know there was an updated schedule sent out last night, and I actually haven't double checked to make sure I'm correct, but the yellow highlights are our working group meetings. When Mayor Colvin and I were looking at this, we thought we would need at least one additional meeting to really get these things done. And how we kind of bucketed things out in just our thinking was, the first, we would take each of these at an entire meeting so we could really focus and drill down for each of our 3 subject matter areas. So the first meeting on the 20th would be recruitment and retention. Then on the 17th would be training. And then on October 1st would be accountability and culture. Not to say that we can't talk about all of this as that comes up, because they are very intertwined and overlapping, but just in terms of perhaps getting some speakers and spacing out the speakers to help us understand some of the issues. Wanted to add another proposed additional meeting to make some initial recommendations and then finalize our recommendations for the commission here. That said, this is fluid and flexible. This is just helping to give us an idea of a timeline. So what I can do after this meeting is send out an email to everyone to make sure that 10/22 works. It is a Thursday at 10 a.m. like our other meetings are scheduled. And hopefully that would be able to add that in. Then if we feel like we need additional meetings from there, we can look at doing that. If I understand kind of the takeaways in terms of what the homework is, so to speak, from this meeting, I think we looked at 3 of our areas of responsibility. We looked at all 3. And in terms of area responsibility number 1, that would be recruitment, retention, also talking about barriers to entry. So before the next meeting, I will look through the code and the administrative code and see what areas there might be to consider, and we'll send that out to the members of the committee. And then in terms of recruitment, we will look for a speaker who can talk about best practices in recruiting. And also, Chief, if you would, I don't know, I've ever gotten to assign homework to a chief, so this is exciting. If you would give us the information on Noble and ISCP that we might want to incorporate in the reading for everyone for next time. And then if you have any thoughts or suggestions also as to who we might reach out to, if either of those entities has someone who might be good to talk about these recruitment strategies, including, tiering our recruitment strategies for different size agencies, I would be happy to go one-on-one with you about that, and we can talk about that. I think we'll be seeing each other a lot next week, so we can also talk about it then. And then Also, moving from there, we'll get data answers to a couple of questions. One, what is the racial makeup across the state of what our officers are? And then the second is data demographics on graduation rates. So we'll work on getting those answers for everyone. And then in terms of future meetings, we'll get some area of responsibility. Number 2 was training. And so talking about ongoing training and making that training intentional, we'll look for a speaker on that topic. And the area of responsibility number 3, looking at accountability and culture, we can look at perhaps leadership training, having some idea of what is currently provided surrounding culture at the Justice Academy and whether there are other ideas for additional trainings there. Also, on the idea of citizen review boards, I think what I was hearing from everyone is that there are essentially 2 issues. Number 1, what power do they have to actually make some changes? And number 2, what does it work, and does it really give us what we want in terms of the accountability piece and the transparency? And so we'll try to have a speaker who can drill down on those issues. I also see 4 legal issues in terms of universal body cam requirements, who gets to see the body cam footage and when, which would require a legislative change, what power there is for a civilian review board to actually take action. Do they have hiring, firing power? Does it make a difference whether it's a police department or a sheriff's office? And then the access to personnel records, which is again another legal barrier that I know that we would need to work through and look at in any recommendation that we would have. So I'll have a speaker who can maybe speak to some of those issues and give us some ideas, I think, for the second meeting, not the 8/20 meeting, but the one after that. And then also the issue of statewide versus local civilian review boards. We'll see if anybody knows anything about that. So those are I think the takeaways that I had. And if I missed anything, please let me know. And I'll start moving down each of those paths to get additional information for everyone and then get that out to everyone to read ahead of time. So again, we're not having to play catch up during the meeting. If there was anything I missed, please let me know.
And Leslie, your dates are still accurate.
Okay. Thanks, Jasmine.
Anyway,
and I also think I failed to mention that we have Jasmine McGee and Jean-Paul Jacquet, who are 2 of our co-leads here, Jean-Paul from Justice Earl's office and Jasmine from DOJ. I failed to introduce them, and I apologize, guys, that I did not do that at the beginning.
Ms. Muse, anyway, we can get a copy of that summary sent to us that you just rolled off so that we can
Yes, sir.
recap.
I will type it up because right now it's chicken scratch and I don't think that you could probably read my writing. So I will type that up and get that out to the members of the group.
All right. Well, board work group members, anything else, Representative Gallard or Chief Davis, do we need to talk about before we jump off? We're 5 minutes over our goal, so I promise to recognize your time. Chief, Representative Gallard.
I'm good. I was just gonna, if you, Mayor, and the chief didn't have an objection, if maybe when whatever information got sent out, if we could, I'm so sorry, if we could share our cell phones, there might be some need to have a conversation that could not have to be had in this forum that could maybe help streamline a few of our meetings.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't have an objection if you don't.
Yeah, no, sir. If you could share that, or we can send it, make sure we have our contacts.
And I also have an Excel spreadsheet that includes your contact information for your assistants as well. So I can send that to the group that I've got, and then you guys can update however you need to.
All right.
If I can just say one quick word. One, I want to compliment you guys. You guys were just rocking and rolling, really getting into very concrete and useful things. I think you made a lot of progress today. And 2, we didn't get a ton of notice on this because it came together quickly, but we're doing a series of regional engagements with community leaders all across the state starting tomorrow. And we've got one for the Triad. And any of you, even though none of y'all are Triad residents, you're welcome to join us and hear what people have to say there. And then we've got a few more next week. And you should have gotten an email about that yesterday.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Well, thank you all. Great meeting. Look forward to seeing you next time.